The first thing I remember about that night is the sound of the rain hammering against the windows, drowning out the angry voices in the kitchen. My mother was yelling, her words sharp and clipped, but my father's voice was low, steady, and worse, final. I had heard them argue about me before, but this was different. This time, I wasn't just a disappointment. I was a problem to be solved. "You think he's just going to wake up one day and change?" my mother snapped, her heels clicking against the tile as she paced. "He's 17. If he doesn't care now, he never will." "He's wasting space," my father said simply, not even looking at her, just sipping his tea like we were discussing the weather. "I won't support a failure." I had been standing in the doorway for nearly 5 minutes, my report card still clutched in my hand, the red marks bleeding into my skin from how hard I was gripping it. I had known this was coming. The moment I had seen my grades, I had known. My parents didn't tolerate mediocrity. They barely tolerated anything less than perfection. "Say something," my mother hissed at me, finally turning her burning gaze in my direction. "Do you have nothing to say for yourself?" I started, but my throat felt like it had closed up. "You what?" she snapped, arms crossed so tightly it looked like she was holding herself together. "You're sorry? You'll try harder? You'll magically grow a brain overnight?" My father placed his teacup down on the table, so softly it made the hair on my arms stand up. He was watching me now, assessing, already making a decision I hadn't been informed of yet. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose like he had already lost interest in whatever I had to say. "Pack your things." For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. "What?" My voice cracked, and I hated how weak it sounded. "You don't listen, and you don't learn," he said, his eyes colder than I'd ever seen them. "You have no future in this house. I'm done feeding someone who refuses to help himself. Get out." I turned to my mother, silently pleading, but her lips pressed into a thin, unforgiving line. "We gave you every opportunity, every chance, and you spit in our faces," she said, shaking her head. "This is what you wanted, isn't it? To be free of us? To do whatever stupid, useless thing you dream about instead of getting a real education?" I didn't even realize I had stepped backward until I hit the wall behind me. My skin felt too tight, my pulse hammering in my ears, drowning out the static that was building in my head. I wanted to argue, wanted to tell them that I wasn't useless, that I wasn't throwing my life away, but the words wouldn't come. What would be the point? They had made up their minds long before this conversation had started. So I turned and walked to my room, numb, detached, like my body wasn't my own. I grabbed my backpack, shoved in whatever clothes I could reach, my hands shaking so hard I almost dropped my camera. My camera. The only thing that was really mine. The only thing that made sense in a house that never felt like home. I barely noticed the way my fingers clenched around it as I slung the bag over my shoulder and walked out of the room, down the hall, past the kitchen where my parents didn't even look at me as I moved toward the door. No goodbyes. No second chances. Just the click of the lock behind me and the rain soaking through my clothes as I stepped into the night. I stood there for a second, frozen, staring at the closed door like it might swing open again, like my mother might come rushing out, regret written all over her face, telling me to come back inside, that it was just a lesson, a scare tactic, a way to make me take school more seriously. But nothing happened. The house was silent, the only light spilling from the living room window, glowing warm and safe. But I wasn't welcome there anymore. My fingers curled into fists. I couldn't stand there like an idiot, waiting for people who didn't care about me to change their minds. I swallowed hard and turned away, my shoes slapping against the wet pavement as I started walking. I didn't even know where I was going, just that I needed to keep moving. The streets were empty, the air thick with the smell of rain and damp concrete, headlights from passing cars cutting through the night like knives. I could feel the water seeping into my jacket, my hoodie already useless against the downpour, but I barely noticed. My mind was spinning, replaying my father's words over and over again, like my brain wanted to make sure I really understood just how much I had been discarded. Wasting space. No future. Get out. I grit my teeth and kept walking. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, my fingers numb from the cold, and hovered over my contacts. I could call James, my best friend, but his parents were strict, and I knew there was no way they'd let me crash there. I could try my aunt, my mom's older sister, but they hadn't spoken in years, and I doubted she'd suddenly take my side now. I was alone. I stopped under an awning, wiping the rain from my face, my breath coming out in sharp bursts. I had no money, no plan, and nowhere to go. For the first time since I had stepped outside, panic started to settle into my bones, heavy and suffocating. I had no idea what to do. And then, like some cruel joke, my phone buzzed in my hand. A message from my father. "Don't come back. You made your choice." I stared at the words, my chest tightening, my vision blurring as the weight of it all crashed down on me at once. They really meant it. This wasn't a fight I could fix with an apology or a promise to do better. I was really truly on my own. A car sped past, splashing water up onto the sidewalk, soaking my jeans, but I barely flinched. I looked up at the dark sky, at the empty streets, at the city stretched out in front of me, cold and unfamiliar. And then I did the only thing I could do. I put my phone in my pocket, adjusted my bag over my shoulder, and started walking. The city at night was different from the way it looked during the day, and it wasn't just because of the neon lights buzzing over gas stations or the way the streets seemed wider when they were empty. The world felt bigger when you had no place to be, when you weren't on your way home or meeting up with friends or doing anything that made you part of it. I walked until my legs ached, the damp weight of my backpack pressing against my shoulders, the rain finally letting up but leaving the air thick and cold. Every time I passed a diner or a gas station, I told myself I'd go inside and figure something out, but I kept walking, like moving forward was enough to make everything better. My parents had thrown me out without a second thought, and it wasn't like I had dozens of options waiting for me, but I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of crawling back, begging them to let me sleep in my own bed again. I wasn't going to prove them right. When I finally forced myself to stop, I realized I had no idea where I was. The streets weren't completely unfamiliar, but they weren't places I had ever needed to know. I checked my phone, even though I didn't have anyone to call, and saw the time. Almost midnight. I knew James was probably home, maybe up playing video games, but I couldn't call him. His parents barely let me inside when I visited, always side-eyeing me like they were waiting for me to steal something, and I wasn't about to show up at his window like some stray animal. I thought about my aunt again, but it had been years since she and my mom had spoken, and even if she wanted to help me, she probably wouldn't even believe me. I didn't have anywhere to go, but I couldn't just stand there waiting for the night to decide what to do with me. I thought about the park a few blocks away. The one kid stopped going to after dark because of the kind of people who lingered there, but it had benches, and I wasn't in a position to be picky. My feet were dragging by the time I reached it. The playground nothing more than a few rusted swings and a slide that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. There were a couple of people further down, huddled near the old picnic tables, but they weren't looking at me, and I wasn't looking at them. I found the driest bench I could, set my bag beside me, and stared at my phone again, like the screen would suddenly light up with a message telling me this was all some kind of mistake. It wasn't. I checked my bank account, even though I already knew I had less than $20. My dad had cut me off a long time ago, making sure I earned my own spending money, but with school taking up most of my time, I only worked enough to buy the things he refused to pay for. I thought about food, but the idea of spending money on anything felt like watching it disappear. I didn't know how long I'd be out here, and I didn't want to waste anything before I had to. The wind picked up, and I pulled my jacket tighter, trying to shake off the chill creeping into my bones. It wasn't supposed to be this cold, but sitting still made it worse. I glanced at the group near the tables again, realizing I recognized one of them, or at least I thought I did. A guy from school, someone I had seen in the hallways but never talked to. He was wearing the same hoodie I had seen him in during lunch, his hands shoved deep into the pockets, his hood pulled up to block the wind. I wasn't sure if he saw me or if he was just looking around, but for a second, our eyes met, and I forced myself to look away. I didn't want to be noticed, didn't want anyone asking me why I was there, or why I looked like I was waiting for someone who wasn't coming. I should have gone to a shelter, but I didn't know where any of them were, and I didn't want to search for something that would make this feel more real than it already was. I just needed to get through the night, figure something out in the morning, Pretend like this was just temporary. I wasn't homeless. I was just waiting. Did you run away or get kicked out? The voice made me jump, and I looked up to see the guy from school standing a few feet away, his hands still in his pockets, his hood casting a shadow over his face. I didn't know his name, but I knew his reputation. He was the kind of guy people talked about in whispers, someone who had been in fights, who had disappeared for weeks at a time, who didn't care about anything. He wasn't someone I wanted to deal with right now, but ignoring him wasn't an option. I didn't run away, I muttered, looking down at my hands. Guess that answers my question. He nodded like it wasn't a big deal and sat down at the other end of the bench, pulling out a cigarette and lighting it without asking if I cared. I didn't. Not really. I didn't say anything, and he didn't ask me anything else, just sat there smoking, his gaze on something I couldn't see. I could feel him looking at me every now and then, like he was waiting for me to say something, but I didn't know what he wanted to hear. You got somewhere to go? I hesitated. Lying felt pointless, but admitting the truth made me feel pathetic. Not yet. He exhaled slowly, tapping ash onto the ground, and nodded like he had expected that answer. You got money? I frowned, shifting on the bench. I'm not asking you for anything. Didn't say you were. He flicked the cigarette away, watching the embers fade into the dirt. Just trying to figure out if you're going to be stuck here all night or not. I didn't know why he cared, but I wasn't in a position to question it. I'll figure it out. He didn't laugh or tell me I was screwed, just pulled his hood down lower and stood up, stretching like he had been sitting there too long. There's an old laundromat a couple blocks down. No one cares if you sleep in there. Better than freezing your ass off here. I looked up at him, trying to read his face, but there wasn't much there. Why are you telling me this? He shrugged. You don't look like you belong out here. I didn't know what to say to that, but he didn't wait for an answer. He just walked back to the picnic tables, saying something to one of the others before sitting down like he hadn't just thrown me a lifeline. I looked at my bag, at the empty park, at the path leading back to the streets I had been walking all night. I didn't trust him, but I didn't have better options. I grabbed my things, pulled my hood up, and started walking toward the laundromat. The laundromat was exactly what I expected, bright fluorescent lights, the smell of detergent thick in the air, and a row of mostly broken washing machines humming against the silence. A bored-looking old man sat behind the counter, barely glancing up from his newspaper as I stepped inside, dripping water onto the tile. A couple of dryers rattled on the far side of the room, clothes tumbling behind fogged-up glass, but the people waiting for them didn't look at me. I wasn't sure if that was a good thing or not, but I wasn't about to complain. I just needed somewhere to sit, somewhere to breathe, somewhere that didn't feel like I was completely out of options. I found a spot near the back, away from the security cameras, and dropped my bag onto the bench beside me, resting my arms on my knees, trying to shake the stiffness from my fingers. I didn't know how long I would be able to stay, but it was warm, and no one was telling me to leave yet. That was good enough for now. I checked my phone again, not really expecting anything, but still feeling that sinking weight in my stomach when I saw the empty notifications. No missed calls. No messages. Not from James, not from my aunt, not from anyone who might have noticed I wasn't home. It had been hours since I left, but it was obvious my parents had no intention of reaching out. They weren't waiting for me to come back. They had made that clear when they locked the door behind me. I let out a slow breath, pressing my palms against my face, trying to force my thoughts into something useful. I had some money, but not enough to get through more than a day or two if I spent it carelessly. I needed food, but I wasn't hungry enough to waste what I had. I needed a plan, but I couldn't even think straight. I was so focused on the floor that I didn't hear someone walking up until they were standing right in front of me, and when I looked up, I saw the guy from the park again, hands in his hoodie pockets, looking at me like he had already decided I was a lost cause. I didn't know why he was here, but I wasn't in the mood to deal with him, especially not after everything else. You're still alive, he muttered, glancing at my bag like he was checking to see if I still had it. Figured you'd wander off and freeze to death. I sighed, leaning back against the wall, too tired to argue. What do you want? He didn't sit down, just rocked back on his heels, looking around like he was waiting for someone else to notice him. Relax, I'm not here to rob you. Just making sure you didn't get yourself killed. Why do you care? I don't. He shrugged, pulling his hood lower. Just don't like when people waste my advice. I didn't know what to say to that, but he didn't seem to care if I answered. He glanced over at the guy behind the counter, then back at me, lowering his voice just enough that I had to actually focus to hear him. You can probably stay here for a couple of hours, but they'll kick you out if you start falling asleep. Cameras don't catch everything, but they notice that. I frowned, shifting on the bench. Where am I supposed to go then? Not my problem, he said, like it was obvious. But he didn't walk away, didn't leave me to figure things out on my own. He was watching me, studying the way I rubbed my hands together, the way I shifted my weight like I couldn't get comfortable. Then he sighed, shaking his head like he already regretted what he was about to say. There's an old bus station a few blocks from here. It's shut down, but some of the benches are still there. It's not great, but it's covered, and no one's gonna bother you if you stay quiet. I didn't know why he kept telling me these things, why he kept giving me options instead of just ignoring me like everyone else, but I wasn't about to argue with him. If he was trying to mess with me, he would have done it already. I grabbed my bag, slinging it over my shoulder, ignoring the way my muscles protested. I was exhausted, but I didn't have the luxury of resting. You got a name? I asked, not really expecting an answer. He hesitated, like he wasn't sure if I was worth the effort, then shrugged. Logan. I nodded, adjusting the strap on my bag. Thanks, I guess. Don't thank me, he muttered, stepping back toward the door. You won't be saying that if you're still out here next week. I wasn't sure what he meant by that, but he was gone before I could ask. I watched him disappear down the street, then glanced back at the old man behind the counter, realizing Logan had probably been right about getting kicked out. I needed to move before that happened. The bus station was exactly as abandoned as he had said it would be. Nothing more than a few cracked benches under a half-collapsed awning, the pavement littered with old receipts and cigarette butts. It wasn't much, but it was quiet, and for the first time all night, I felt like I could actually breathe. I found a bench that didn't look too broken, set my bag beside me, and leaned back, staring up at the sky, watching the way the clouds moved slowly past the streetlights. I was still damp from the rain, my hoodie sticking to my skin, but I didn't care. This was what I had now. I pulled out my phone again, my fingers hovering over James's number, but I didn't call. He would ask too many questions, and I wasn't ready to answer them. He would offer to help, but I knew it wouldn't be his choice. His parents wouldn't let me stay, and I wasn't going to make him argue with them over me. I tucked my phone back into my pocket, closed my eyes for a second, just letting myself sit there, forcing my brain to stop running in circles. I didn't know what tomorrow was going to look like, didn't know if I'd be stuck out here for another night, but for now, I just needed to rest. I wasn't sure how long I sat there before I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, not like someone just passing by. My pulse spiked, my fingers twitching toward my bag, ready to grab it and run if I had to. I kept my head down, hoping whoever it was would keep moving, but they didn't. They stopped a few feet away, just close enough that I could see their shoes, dark, scuffed-up sneakers, the kind that had seen too many miles. You're in my spot, the person said, their voice low, sharp, not a request but a warning. I forced myself to look up, my stomach dropping as I met the person's eyes. Whoever they weren't here to help me. I should have known better than to stay in one place for too long. The moment I looked up and saw the guy standing there, his hands buried deep in his pockets, I knew I had screwed up. He wasn't much older than me, but there was something about the way he stood, shoulders squared, chin lifted slightly, that told me he wasn't just here to scare me off. I wasn't worth a warning. He was already deciding how much trouble it would be to take whatever I had. I didn't know this was your spot, I said, forcing myself to sound steady even though my legs were tense, ready to run if I had to. You do now, he muttered, barely moving, but his presence was enough to make my pulse spike. Got anything to make up for trespassing? I took a step back, gripping the strap of my bag, my brain screaming at me to get out before he stopped being polite about it. I was just leaving. Don't rush, he said, but his tone made it clear I didn't have a choice. Not like you got anywhere better to be. He took a slow step forward, his fingers twitching at his sides. I didn't wait for him to finish whatever he was about to say. I turned and ran. I didn't think about where I was going. I just knew I had to move. My bag slammed against my back, my breath sharp in my ears, my feet slipping slightly on the uneven pavement as I cut through an alley, hoping to lose him in the dark. I didn't check to see if he was following. If I looked back, I would slow down, and I couldn't afford that. I ran past a row of dumpsters, the smell making my stomach turn, past a chain-link fence with a section bent low enough that I barely had to jump to clear it. My hands hit the ground hard when I landed on the other side, but I pushed myself up and kept going, forcing myself forward even though my legs felt like they were locking up. I didn't stop until I was sure I had lost him, until my lungs burned and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I leaned against a wall, dragging in unsteady breaths, my heart still hammering as I tried to process how badly I had just screwed up. I had known this wasn't going to be easy, but I hadn't expected it to go bad this fast. I was barely a few hours into this, and I had already almost gotten robbed, or worse. You really don't know what you're doing, do you? The voice made me jump, my body tensing automatically as I turned. But it wasn't the guy from the bus station. It was Logan, standing a few feet away, arms crossed, looking unimpressed. I exhaled sharply, my adrenaline still too high to process the relief of realizing he wasn't here to make things worse. How do you keep finding me? He raised an eyebrow. I don't. You're just making the same mistakes every dumbass new kid makes. I frowned, shifting my weight, still too on edge to let my guard down completely. What does that mean? It means you stick out. He sighed, running a hand through his hair like he was already regretting this conversation. You're walking around like you're lost, sitting in places people like you shouldn't be sitting. It's not hard to figure out where you're gonna end up next. I wanted to argue, but I knew he was right. I had no idea what I was doing. He glanced past me, scanning the alley like he was making sure no one else had followed. Who were you running from? I shook my head, still catching my breath. Some guy at the bus station. Wanted money. Logan didn't look surprised. You give him any? No. His expression didn't change, but I could tell he was reassessing me. Lucky you got away. I didn't say anything, just adjusted my bag, suddenly aware of how obvious it looked, how easy it was to tell I had something worth taking. You keep making dumb choices like that. You're not gonna last a week, he muttered, shaking his head. I clenched my jaw, trying to ignore the way my stomach twisted at the reminder. I don't have a choice. Yeah, you do, he said, his voice flat. You just don't like any of them. I hated how right he was. He exhaled slowly, like he was debating something, then motioned for me to follow. Come on. I hesitated. Where? He rolled his eyes. Not somewhere safe, if that's what you're hoping for. But it's better than standing here waiting for someone worse than that guy to find you. I wasn't sure if I trusted him, but I didn't have a better option. I pulled my hood up, adjusted the strap of my bag, and followed him, telling myself that I wasn't making another mistake. Logan didn't talk much while we walked, but he moved like he had done this 1,000 times before. He kept his hands in his pockets, his head slightly down, his pace steady but not rushed, like he knew exactly which streets to cut through to avoid getting noticed. I followed a few steps behind, trying to keep up without making it obvious that I had no idea where we were going. The city looked different at night when you weren't heading home, when you weren't just passing through. Every alley, every closed shop, every streetlight that flickered felt like something I should be paying attention to, something that might matter if I had to come back this way alone. I wasn't sure if Logan had a plan or if he was just leading me somewhere to get rid of me, but I wasn't about to start asking questions. We passed a convenience store with a couple of guys leaning against the wall outside, their conversation slowing as we walked by. Logan didn't look at them, didn't acknowledge them at all, but I saw the way his shoulders tensed slightly, the way his steps got just a little quicker until we turned the corner. He only spoke once we had put some distance between us, his voice low enough that I almost didn't hear him. Don't stare at people like that, he muttered, barely turning his head. Makes you look like you're waiting for them to notice you. I hadn't even realized I had been staring, but I didn't argue. He was right. I was making it obvious I didn't belong here. I kept my eyes forward after that, letting him decide when to slow down, when to keep moving, when to avoid a street entirely. It wasn't until we reached an old, run-down building that he finally stopped, stepping onto the cracked pavement outside and glancing at me like he was waiting for me to figure something out. "This isn't a shelter," he said, like he already expected me to ask. "But people crash here sometimes when they don't have anywhere else to go." I looked at the building again, taking in the boarded-up windows, the way one of the doors had been forced open just enough to squeeze through. It didn't exactly look inviting, but compared to the streets, it wasn't the worst option. I wasn't about to start complaining. "How many people stay here?" I asked, shifting my bag higher on my shoulder. "Depends," Logan said, already heading toward the door. "Some nights no one. Some nights too many." He slipped through the gap without waiting for me to follow, and for a second, I considered turning around. I didn't know him. I didn't know what kind of people would be inside. I didn't even know if this was better than just waiting out the night somewhere else. But I didn't have anywhere else, and the reality of that hit me harder than I wanted to admit. I pushed through the door, stepping into the stale air of what used to be a storage room, the faint smell of old wood and dust making my throat tighten. The space was dim, the only light coming from a few battery-powered lanterns scattered around the floor. A couple of old mattresses were pushed up against the walls, a few blankets and backpacks spread out beside them. Logan didn't say anything as he walked toward the far corner, dropping down onto one of the mattresses like he had been here 100 times before. I stayed near the entrance, my grip tightening around my bag, my heartbeat still uneven. "Relax," Logan muttered, pulling something out of his hoodie pocket. An energy bar, half crushed from being shoved around too much. "No one's gonna jump you in here." I wasn't sure if that was supposed to be reassuring, or if he was just stating a fact. "Why are you helping me?" The question had been in my head for a while, but I hadn't said it out loud until now. Logan didn't answer right away. He took a bite of the bar, chewing slowly, like he was thinking about whether or not it was worth explaining. When he finally spoke, his tone was flat, unreadable. "You remind me of someone." I waited for him to say more, but he didn't, and I got the feeling he wasn't going to. "You don't even know me," I pointed out, watching him closely. "I know enough," he said, not looking at me. "I know you're not ready for this. I know you think you can figure it out, but you won't. I know you're too stubborn to ask for help, but not smart enough to turn it down when it's in front of you." I didn't know if I should be offended or grateful, but he wasn't wrong. "You got money?" he asked, his tone casual, but the question caught me off guard. "Why?" "Because no one helps for free," he said, finally looking up at me. "Not out here." I tensed, my grip on my bag tightening instinctively. "I don't have much." "Didn't ask how much," he said, stretching out his legs like he wasn't in a rush for an answer. "Asked if you had any." I hesitated. I didn't trust him, not completely, but if he wanted to rob me, he could have done it already. He hadn't led me into an alley, hadn't waited until I was too exhausted to run. He could have knocked me down back in the laundromat and taken whatever he wanted, but he didn't. "I've got a little," I admitted, my voice careful. "Not enough for anything long-term." Logan nodded like he had expected that. "Then don't waste it. You don't buy food unless you know where your next meal is coming from. You don't spend on anything unless it gets you through another day. You don't trust anyone, and you don't tell people what you have unless you want them to take it from you." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay still, to process what he was saying without letting the weight of it settle too deep in my chest. "You trust people?" Logan let out a short, quiet laugh, shaking his head. "I don't need to. I already know what they want." I wasn't sure if that was an answer or a warning. "You planning on staying out here forever?" he asked, shifting slightly, watching me again. "No," I said, my jaw tightening. "I just don't have anywhere else right now." He studied me for a second, then nodded, like that answer was good enough. "Then don't screw up before you figure something out." I didn't know how long I was going to be out here. I didn't know if I was ever going back. But I knew one thing, Logan was right. If I kept making mistakes, I wasn't going to last. The first night in that abandoned building was the longest I had ever lived through. I sat with my back against the wall, my bag between my arms, my fingers curled tightly around the straps like I thought someone would try to rip it away in my sleep. But sleep never came. Every sound, every movement, every shift in the air had my body on edge. My mind convinced something was about to go wrong. Logan had stretched out on his mattress like this was just another night. Like nothing about this situation was unusual for him. I envied that, the way he could shut his eyes and let himself rest, like there was nothing to be afraid of. I wondered how long he had been out here, how many nights he had spent like this before it stopped feeling like a mistake. By the time morning came, my head ached from exhaustion, my limbs stiff from barely moving. Logan sat up without saying anything, rubbing a hand over his face before standing, stretching his arms above his head like he had slept perfectly fine. He glanced at me, expression unreadable, then shoved his hands into his hoodie pockets before speaking. Figured you wouldn't sleep. I didn't answer, just shifted slightly, my back sore from leaning against the hard surface all night. He didn't seem surprised, just nodded like he had expected it. You planning on sitting here all day? I blinked at him, my brain slow from exhaustion. Do I have a better option? Logan sighed, stepping toward the door. Not unless you like starving to death. I tensed at the reminder. I had gone almost a full day without food, and my stomach was starting to make that painfully obvious. I had money, but I knew better than to waste it on something that wouldn't last. Logan had already warned me about that. He paused by the door, waiting to see if I was going to follow. I hesitated for a second, then stood, slinging my bag over my shoulder before stepping forward. He didn't say anything, just turned and walked out, and I followed, telling myself it was better to be moving than sitting there waiting for nothing to change. We walked for a while without talking, the streets already filling with people who had places to be, lives to live. No one looked twice at us. To them, we were just part of the background, another couple of faces that didn't matter. I wasn't sure where Logan was leading me, but he moved with purpose, his steps confident, his posture relaxed like this was just another normal day. I kept my head down, my grip on my bag still too tight, my body still on edge even though nothing had happened yet. Eventually, Logan stopped in front of a gas station, glancing back at me for the first time in blocks. You got enough to get something small? I nodded, already reaching for my pocket. Then don't be an idiot about it, he muttered, shoving his hands into his hoodie as he stepped forward, pushing open the door. I followed, the sudden rush of cold air making my skin prickle as I took in the shelves of snacks, the flickering fluorescent lights overhead. A man stood behind the counter, barely glancing at us as we walked in, his attention focused on the small TV in the corner. Logan didn't hesitate, heading straight for the back, but I lingered, my mind calculating exactly how much I could afford to spend. I grabbed a protein bar, something small but enough to take the edge off, then hesitated, glancing toward the bottled water before shaking my head. I didn't know when I would be able to buy more, and I couldn't waste what little I had left. Logan reappeared beside me, holding nothing, his gaze flicking toward the bar in my hand before nodding slightly. Good choice, he muttered, then turned and walked toward the door without another word. I watched him leave, then forced myself to move, stepping toward the counter and placing my item down. The man rang it up without speaking, barely looking at me, and I handed over the money, shoving the change deep into my pocket before taking my food and stepping outside. Logan was leaning against the wall, hands in his pockets, watching people pass by with that same unreadable expression. You didn't get anything? I asked, unwrapping the bar. Didn't need to, he said, pushing away from the wall. Come on. I didn't ask where we were going this time, just followed, biting into the food, my stomach clenching as it finally had something to work with. Logan didn't say anything as we walked, but I could tell he was watching, checking to see if I was paying attention, if I was learning anything. After a while, we ended up near a parking lot behind a strip mall, the smell of old grease and trash making my stomach turn slightly. Logan leaned against the back of a dumpster, arms crossed, his expression flat. You need a way to make money, he said, voice even. I tensed, shifting on my feet. I know. You got skills? I hesitated. I used to take pictures. Logan snorted. Yeah, that's real useful out here. I clenched my jaw, but he wasn't wrong. He studied me for a second, then sighed. There are ways to make money fast, but most of them aren't worth the risk. I swallowed hard, my pulse picking up. Like what? Logan didn't answer right away, just looked at me, like he was trying to decide how much I needed to hear. You can beg, he said finally, his tone unreadable. You can steal. You can do things that make you wish you hadn't. I stiffened, looking away. Or, he continued, you can be smart about it. You can find ways to make just enough to get by without getting yourself into something you can't get out of. I didn't know if I wanted to ask what that meant, but Logan didn't wait for me to. You ever cleaned windshields? I blinked at him, thrown off by the question. What? He smirked slightly. People at red lights. You wash their windshield. They toss you a couple bucks to get you to leave them alone. I frowned. That actually works? Sometimes, he said with a shrug. Better than sitting around doing nothing. I exhaled slowly, glancing around. Where do I get the stuff? Logan pulled something from his hoodie pocket, tossing it at me. I caught it automatically, my fingers closing around a dirty rag, the fabric rough against my skin. You figure it out, he said simply. I looked down at the rag, then back up at him. He wasn't joking. He wasn't handing me an easy answer. He was telling me that if I wanted to survive, I had to do the work myself. I nodded once, gripping the rag tighter. I didn't like it, but he was right. Nothing was going to come easy. The first few hours were nothing but frustration. I picked a spot near an intersection, close enough to traffic, but not so obvious that someone would tell me to leave. I watched how others did it before even trying, the way they moved between cars, the way they kept their hands open, non-threatening, their heads slightly lowered like they already expected to be ignored. It wasn't just about washing the windshield. It was about being seen as a minor inconvenience, something that people wanted to get rid of quickly by handing over whatever loose change they had. Logan hadn't stayed to watch, but I knew he'd find out how it went. He always did. The first driver waved me off before I even got close. The second shook his head without rolling down the window. The third ignored me entirely, staring straight ahead like I wasn't even there. I swallowed my pride, moved to the next car, and tried again. The first hour passed without making anything, my stomach tightening with every rejection, my fingers gripping the rag so tightly that it felt like it was the only thing keeping me from falling apart. Finally, an older man sighed, rolled his window down just enough to shove a few crumpled bills at me, and muttered, "Don't touch the car." I nodded, taking the money without arguing. I didn't even bother unfolding it, just shoved it into my pocket before stepping away. I wanted to feel relieved, but all I felt was drained. By the time I had enough to buy something to eat, the sun was already starting to drop behind the buildings. I made my way back toward the gas station, the same one Logan had taken me to before, and stepped inside, ignoring the way the cashier's eyes lingered on me a little too long. I grabbed another protein bar, a bottle of water this time, and counted out the money carefully before handing it over. The man didn't say anything, just took it and handed me the change, his gaze still watching me like he was waiting for me to steal something. I stepped outside, unwrapping the bar as I leaned against the wall, letting the exhaustion settle in now that I wasn't trying to push through it. I had food. I had a little bit of money left. I had made it through the day, but I wasn't any closer to figuring out what came next. "Didn't think you'd actually try," Logan's voice came from beside me, making me tense before I saw him leaning against the corner of the building. I didn't bother asking how long he had been there. He always showed up when I least expected it, always watching, always waiting. "Made enough to eat," I said, taking another bite, my voice flat. "That's more than most do their first time," he admitted, pushing away from the wall. "How much you got left?" I hesitated, but I already knew lying to him wouldn't do any good. "A couple of bucks." Logan nodded slightly, like that answer meant something. "Good. Means you're not an idiot." I should have been insulted, but I wasn't. If anything, it felt like the closest thing to approval he had ever given me. "Come on," he said, already turning away. I sighed but followed, my body too tired to argue. He led me away from the main roads, cutting through side streets, moving like he had lived out here for years. He didn't tell me where we were going, but at this point, I had stopped asking. Eventually, we ended up back at the abandoned building, the one we had stayed in the night before. Logan stepped inside like it was nothing, like there had never been a question about whether we were coming back. I hesitated for a second, then followed, my feet dragging slightly against the floor. "You figure out what you're doing yet?" he asked, dropping down onto his mattress. I sat against the wall, setting my bag beside me. I'm working on it. Logan snorted, shaking his head. Yeah, well, work faster. I glanced at him, frowning slightly. Why do you care? For the first time, he didn't answer right away. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling like he was deciding how much to say. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, less sharp than usual. You remind me of someone, he muttered, repeating what he had said before. Who? He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. Doesn't matter. I didn't push, but I could tell there was more to it than that. We sat in silence for a while, the air thick with something unspoken, something I wasn't sure I wanted to understand. Logan didn't talk about himself much. He never explained how he ended up here, never told me what had happened before all of this. But I could tell he had been doing this for longer than he should have. You ever think about leaving? I asked, my voice careful. Logan didn't look at me, just stretched out his legs, his hands resting loosely on his stomach. Where would I go? I didn't have an answer. He let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. That's what I thought. I leaned my head back against the wall, staring up at the cracks in the ceiling, the faded graffiti on the walls. I didn't know how long I was going to be here. I didn't know if this was just temporary, or if I was already sinking too deep into something I wouldn't be able to climb out of. A notification buzzed on my phone, and I pulled it out, my heart pounding for a second before I saw what it was. Not a message, not a missed call, just a bank alert. Account closed. I stared at the screen, my fingers tightening around the device, my breath catching in my throat as the weight of it settled in. My father had cut me off completely. No money, no safety net, no way back. I let out a slow breath, turning off the screen before slipping the phone back into my pocket. Logan didn't ask what was wrong. Maybe he already knew. Guess I better work faster, I muttered. Logan smirked slightly, shaking his head. Told you. I closed my eyes for a second, then pushed myself up, adjusting my bag, ignoring the exhaustion settling deep in my bones. There was nothing left to wait for. It was time to survive.